For scientific research are only part of the story of Brooks. It is a story that transcends an Air Force base and the people there who were visionaries and innovators.
People don't realize what the military does. Everybody thinks of war and people getting injured and killed and so on, but they don't realize for everybody that's injured or killed in the wartime, they may keep thousands of people alive, because a lot of us, I'm just one small guy at that in there, things that have, contributions that have come out of the military, not just in medicine, so many things that actually improves the quality of life and life itself.
To the Brooks Air Force Base community in San Antonio, Texas, helping protect and preserve life in a world continually in peril from natural and man-made dangers was not something they had hoped to achieve. It was, however, something they had to do to fulfill their duty to serve man. Foremost in service to mankind, Brooks scientific research encompassed the Air Force's dedication to warfighter performance and survival. Their work also embodied an unwavering commitment to enhance public health and safety. Disease control and prevention was one of the cornerstones of Brooks Air Force Base research that benefited humanity. During the Ford administration, the Air Force Surgeon General tasked the School of Aerospace Medicine's Epidemiology Division at Brooks with finding a way to prevent a mass influenza outbreak. The impetus for this action was an emerging swine flu epidemic that began in 1976 with the death of a Fort Dix, New Jersey soldier. The place of the outbreak and the suspected virus variant involved was eerily similar to an influenza strain that was believed to have started among soldiers at an Army post in Kansas. That event led to the most notorious pandemic of the 20th century, killing countless millions of people. With great urgency, the Air Force's Project Gargle was launched to study flu types, how they spread, and their effect on Air Force populations.
Project Gargle actually began in 1976, and this was a program to look at, it was public health for the Air Force. We have people overseas doing their normal work, so collecting samples, if they fit the case definition for respiratory illness, were sent here so that it could be examined and we could get an idea of what was going on. And the fact that they were in areas of the world where influenza develops, or they were traveling or coming back into this country, made it necessary to look for influenza and share that information with the CDC, because they may not have that same information.
By 1982, Brooks scientists had discovered a new influenza strain. Their work helped prevent a major outbreak.
We work very closely with the CDC and the World Health Organization and provide our information to them. And there have been a few years in the past decade or so to where one of the strains that we identified through our process was actually part of the flu vaccine that was developed to reduce the influence of that strain once it got to the United States.
Air Force diligence in having provided scientific data to the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, also known as the CDC, enhanced the effectiveness of commercially produced flu vaccines. While Project Gargle initially focused on safeguarding the health of airmen and their families, the program residually supported global public health. However, Air Force scientists at Brooks also knew that their contributions to vaccine development hinged upon changes within influenza strains caused by virus mutations.
Nature makes mistakes sometimes and it mutates, and our biggest worry is that different species will change and become adaptable to human infection. And then we would have no experience and we would have no protection against that particular virus.
2 years before avian influenza, also known as the bird flu, appeared in Asia, the CDC relied on Brooks virologists to verify mutations in samples of a flu strain in Chinese poultry. At stake was a potential global outbreak that was averted, in part to modifications made to a vaccine based on Brooks research. Brooks scientists' commitment to helping safeguard public health involved preventing worldwide disease outbreaks called pandemics. Such a pandemic had ravaged the Earth during World War I. The influenza strain, which killed more people than the Black Plague of the Middle Ages, was, like the bird flu, also avian in origin. The Spanish flu pandemic, which started in 1918 and ended in 1920, claimed the lives of an estimated 50 to 130 million people worldwide. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history. In America, the Spanish influenza virus killed 28% of the U.S. population. So virulent was the disease that many healthcare workers did not tend to the sick, nor gravediggers bury the dead, because they were too ill. In many communities, mass graves were dug by steam shovel, and bodies were buried without coffins.
This is 1918. The first influenza virus was isolated in the 1930s. They did determine it was influenza. I mean, influenza as an illness has been around for many years, but it was unlike anything that had been seen before that. It was very virulent. It was people died very quickly. There were reports of people, 4 women playing cards together one evening, and the next day 3 of them died. Or somebody getting on a streetcar to go to work and died. And there's another mystery on that particular virus, that it was the 19 to 24-year-olds that had the highest incidence of disease. It's during the war. You have soldiers. They're being transported across country in trains. There was troop ships that went over to Europe. So there was a lot of crowding, which certainly helped perpetuate the illness. The life expectancy dropped 12 years during this particular flu pandemic.
This global catastrophe produced a mortality rate estimated to have been 10 to 20% of those who were infected. The unusual severity of the disease dwarfed the usual flu epidemic mortality rate of 0.1%. Unlike other influenza strains that historically killed the most vulnerable, such as infants and the elderly, the Spanish flu decimated mostly healthy adults under age 65. Within months of the outbreak, the Spanish flu virus had mutated to a much deadlier form. Except for some senior citizens, people generally had no immunity to the disease. To prevent another Spanish flu pandemic from occurring again, the Air Force acted quickly when bird flu first emerged in Hong Kong, China in 1997. That year, the Global Emerging Infection Surveillance System, known by the acronym GEIS, was created. The Air Force became one of GEIS's most reliable partners.
It actually began under President Clinton in the mid-1990s when he looked at the aspect of bioterrorism and wondered, how big is this prospect that we could endure? So this was started to start surveillance programs to look at what's emerging and what's coming out so we could catch things early. The Air Force had Project Gargle already in progress, so it came to the Air Force and said, let's make this a tri-service program.
Air Force virologists at Brooks tested influenza samples taken from worldwide Sentinel surveillance sites. Sentinel sites are located in places of high human activity called transit points. They include overseas deployment areas. GEIS shares information with the World Health Organization, foreign ministries, and the CDC in a collaborative effort to mitigate potential disease outbreaks. Brooks researchers analyzed Sentinel site samples taken from patients with respiratory illnesses at military clinical labs. Based on Sentinel site sample analysis, Brooks scientists helped the World Health Organization develop North American flu vaccines. The role of Brooks research expanded after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. A Department of Defense initiative to counter the emerging threat to national security and public safety put Brooks Air Force Base center stage in the development of bioterrorism countermeasures. Bioterrorism became a real threat following the 9/11 attacks, when anthrax and other agents were dispersed against targets in the United States and elsewhere. Terrorists had also used ricin in various attacks that targeted public, private, and commercial interests. Ricin is a man-made toxin produced from waste left over from castor beans that are processed into castor oil. It is among the most lethal substances on Earth. The CDC has validated that 500 micrograms of ricin, an amount equivalent to the size of a pinhead, can kill a healthy adult within 72 hours. It can be inhaled, ingested, or injected. No antidote exists. The emergence of ricin as a terrorist bioweapon prompted federal authorities to task the School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks Air Force Base to develop an antidote for the deadly toxin. Ricin antidote research was an outgrowth of the earlier groundbreaking biological weapons research at Brooks that was inaugurated before the first Persian Gulf War.
We are interested in trying to prevent the use of biological weapons. Again, so we're really more trying to sort of an interdiction. So we develop methods by which you can neutralize agents before they're used against us.
One of the main challenges, of course, is the agents that we're trying to decontaminate. Biological warfare agents are very broad in nature, dealing from bacteria to viruses and toxins. Identifying these different agents is very difficult, especially if you're talking about small amounts of the agents, and being able to detect them in a rapid manner has been an extremely difficult challenge.
Brooks scientists had pioneered DNA aptamer research involving biological agents and unique protocols to counter the threat to military forces and the public.
DNA aptamers are small pieces of DNA that bind specifically to a target, and in our laboratory we've developed DNA aptamers that bind to anthrax, to bind to Shiga toxin, bind to tularemia, bind to Venezuelan equine encephalitis, bind to ovalbumin, and several other targets. Many of the targets are biological threat agents.
The systems that we have developed, though, with the aptamer systems and the detection box systems that we have, can identify these agents in a very short period of time, in basically a matter of minutes. The same thing goes for the decontamination of these agents as well. In the past, it's taken days to kill agents. When you deal with things like chlorine dioxide and vaporous hydrogen peroxide, it can take hours to kill. And now what we have is a system that allows us to kill these agents in a matter of minutes.
One of the most unique tools developed by Brooks scientists to defeat bioterrorism threats is the Nonthermal Plasma device that kills deadly microorganisms. The device uses a radio frequency source to generate a non-thermal cold plasma, or the same ionized gas used in plasma TV screens. The device kills anthrax spores in less than 30 seconds, compared to an older process that took 30 minutes. Brooks innovators had modified existing robotic technology to produce the non-thermal plasma device. The system provides an effective countermeasure to bioterrorism weapons. It was originally designed for military decontamination operations. Its potential, commercially, is more profound in terms of public health. As a portable decontaminator, it can be used to kill potentially deadly microorganisms in ambulances and hospital operating rooms. Developed in 1999, this device and other biological weapon counter-proliferation initiatives at Brooks established the base as a national center for such research.
This work being done at Brooks has obviously put us in the forefront of neutralization technology. With our work that we have in select agents, no one else is actually working on this in the Air Force.
For nearly 50 years, Brooks Air Force Base also had been a center for Air Force high-altitude research. This research program was a continuation of the School of Aerospace Medicine's high-altitude investigations that originated in San Antonio, Texas at Randolph Field in 1942. The school's work at Randolph and later Brooks had a profound impact on aircrew performance and survival at high altitude. Air Force high-altitude investigators' first major contribution to aviator health and safety was made in 1942 with an important discovery. They observed that the incidence of decompression sickness was drastically reduced when aviators pre-breathed 100% oxygen for 45 minutes prior to a mission. Since the 1980s, Brooks high-altitude research has led to significant enhancement of aircrew survival procedures. Their pioneering work also contributed to Air Force policy changes involving high-altitude flight. The primary focus of high-altitude research at Brooks involved decompression sickness. The condition is characterized by debilitating and potentially deadly symptoms. These symptoms include respiratory problems resulting in uncontrollable choking, vision and hearing loss, numbness in the extremities, temporary paralysis, and unconsciousness. The Air Force High-Altitude Protection Program at Brooks also focused on pressure breathing and other physiological factors associated with high-altitude exposure. Altitude chamber simulations showed that a typical U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance flight resulted in a 73% incidence of pilot decompression sickness. Also vulnerable to decompression sickness are Air Force Special Operations parachutists during HALO missions, known as high-altitude low-opening jumps. Years before F-22 fighter pilots began experiencing oxygen deprivation and other high-altitude issues reported in 2012, Brooks scientists had identified the potential for problems.
There was also an issue with the F-22, FA-22. It was more of a, well, it was both a hypoxic and a decompression sickness issue. Unlike previous fighters, the F-22 they planned to fly it higher, up to 60,000 feet instead of the 50,000 limit that the previous fighters had. As a result, if they lost pressurization at that altitude, despite a tight-fitting oxygen mask with positive pressure breathing, they were on the fine edge of losing consciousness.
While the Air Force High-Altitude Research Program ended in 2005 at Brooks, Dr. Pilmanis' colleague, Dr. Jim Webb, provided a reliable system to help the Air Force solve future high-altitude problems. He created the computer-based Altitude Decompression Sickness Risk Assessment Program. Developed and validated by hundreds of high-altitude human exposures over 15 years, the program is an accurate tool for predicting decompression sickness based on flight condition variables. It is one of many initiatives that Brooks scientists pursued to serve man by ensuring the viability of America's warfighters. Brooks scientists also helped develop the onboard oxygen generating system. Commonly called OBox, the system was created in the 1960s to replace the less efficient and more volatile LOX system that used highly combustible liquid oxygen.
The idea for the onboard oxygen was then you would get away from stored supplies. All the aircraft systems used LOX converters, and the first really application came along with the B-1A, when the concept for deployment was that it would be deployed at remote bases with its own tanker. It would take off with a full load of weapons, but not very much fuel, and they would fuel. But the concept of it being deployed at remote locations meant you'd have to have a LOX converter there with it, and that would have to be continuously replenished. If you had its own onboard oxygen generation system for the crew to breathe, then you would get away from the stored supplies, the LOX converters.
OBox became the oxygen delivery system the Air Force relied upon with the advent of the B-1 bomber and the F-16. Advances in fighter aircraft and the high G-forces they produced provided Brooks scientists with new opportunities to resolve physiological issues associated with high-performance flight. Brooks' scientific advances in acceleration research was built upon earlier work conducted during World War II. Prior to and during the early years of the jet age, a simple system was used to provide aviators with sustained G-force protection. It consisted of a commercially developed, inflatable anti-G suit. Additionally, pilots performed a physical muscular straining breathing maneuver that its creator, Dr. Earl Wood of the Mayo Clinic, called the M1 maneuver. This system provided all the G-force protection pilots needed while flying propeller-driven aircraft that produced 5 to 6 Gs during aerial combat maneuvers. It also was sufficient in providing protection to pilots flying jet aircraft during the Vietnam War. While this system provided G protection to F-4 pilots exposed to 7 Gs, AntiG Protection needed to be improved for pilots who flew the next generation fighter, the F-15.
The F-15, the pilots could not fly it at high G, or very few of them could, because all they had was the anti-G straining maneuver called the M1 back then, or the L1. And they had to strain very, very hard to get up to 9 Gs, and that's what that airplane pulled, was 9 G, and the F4 was the prior plane, it pulled 7 Gs. So there was this 2 G gap, and from 7 to 9 is a lot different than from 5 to 7. It's an exponential thing. It's very, very, much more too difficult.
Air crews and high-performance fighters undergo incredible physical stresses during aerial combat maneuvers. These stresses are measured in Gs, short for gravity's exertion upon the human body in flight. Increased gravity forces blood away from the brain. G-suits were developed that applied exterior pressure to push blood back into the upper body, but not the brain. Pilots' use of the M1 straining maneuver helped, but more anti-G support was needed, especially with the 9G producing F-15.
And so the Air Force became very interested in then finding some G protective systems that would work in the F-15.
In 1970, the School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks initiated an acceleration research program that led to the development of advanced anti-G protection systems. Dr. Sidney Leverett, Jr. pioneered Air Force acceleration research with the help of a world-class research team he had assembled at Brooks. By the 1980s, Brooks Air Force Base had become the Air Force Center for acceleration research. The Brooks centrifuge, which produced the same G-forces pilots experienced in high-performance aircraft, was central to the acceleration research effort. The centrifuge was capable of producing the fastest high-G onset rate in the Air Force, 6 Gs in 1 second.
We did such things as putting a fundus camera in the cab of the centrifuge, and while the centrifuge went up to 6, 7 Gs, we took pictures of the fundus of the eye and seen when the blood flow drained out of that.
Dr. Leverett and his research team contributed to the development of G-force protection equipment. This included the creation of a new anti-G valve that inflated anti-G suits as fast as pilots experienced increased Gs. The Brooks research team also initiated the Air Force's first physical conditioning program to increase pilots' G tolerance. This program included a weightlifting regimen and centrifuge training, where fighter pilots were exposed to high Gs. Brooks Acceleration Research's most important contribution to pilot survival involved aviator consciousness. By the early 1970s, Dr. Leverett's team correctly identified, through various studies, that G-induced loss of consciousness, or G-lock, was a major problem.
And we found out that 30–40% of the pilots lost consciousness. It was very common. In the Navy they lost. It was a very common occurrence. But most of the time they were able to recover before they crashed into the ground, but not all the time. And once we knew more about that and what it was and how dangerous it was, because the plane would fly for 30–40 seconds with the pilot totally out of control, you know. And so then that really brought a lot of emphasis into G-induced loss of consciousness, and I think still today they're doing a lot of studies in that area.
The Brooks team's research validated that G-lock was the primary cause of aircraft accidents involving mostly F-16s. Dr. Leverett's group also contributed to new anti-G measures that reduced the incidence of G-lock.
One of the ideas that Sid came up with was, what about re-looking at positive pressure breathing? We realized that performing the L1 maneuver, was in fact, or just a standard straining maneuver, what you were doing is pressurizing the chest, which would force the column of blood up the aorta to the brain. But you couldn't sustain that. You had to breathe. So we came up with a positive pressure breathing coupled with counter pressure in the chest.
We knew that you could do certain things in terms of the way you controlled your breathing and closing of the glottis and increasing the pressure in the chest. But you also had to fly and fight the aircraft at the same time. We then developed some additional equipment that would help the air crew operate in that environment.
By 1988, the Air Force Tactical Air Command required a system be developed that provided F-15 and F-16 crews with enhanced AntiG protection through positive pressure breathing. This led to the development of Combat Edge, short for Combined Advanced Technology Enhanced